Okay.
Hi, Ronelle Delmont's back again with another wonderful interview with somebody I've wanted to talk to for so long. It's wonderful. We didn't start yet, but I'm so happy to meet Stephen Monier. And my biggest question to you right now is, Mr. Monier, is it Monier or Monier?
It's Monier. Yeah.
How
It's
is
the
it?
name is French, but we've anglicized it, so we pronounce it Monier.
Monier. Okay, because
Yes.
I got a French husband. He says Monier. All right. So, uh, you have written a new book that I just bought on Kindle, so I haven't read it yet, but I know about it because I did research in newspapers.com and I went all the way back and found you as a very important person. As a U.S. Marshal, you got yourself involved in what is an incredible standoff. And so you choose which book you want to discuss first, because I know you as the co author of a book that changed my life because it became a hobby and then a website. And
Hmm.
the idea of Charles Lindbergh being guilty of anything to do with the baby that went out the window behind me. Oh, I'm pointing in the wrong direction. This is a photograph from inside the nursery room, and that's supposedly the window upon which Lindbergh found supposedly an authentic kidnap ransom note. So I've chosen this picture because maybe you want to discuss the kidnapping story, but
Sure.
I hope you'll tell us about the standoff that you got involved in. So tell us when you became, okay, go ahead. You do it.
Okay. Well, let's talk first about the book that you make reference to, and that is the book I co-authored with Greg Ahlgren, who's an attorney in Manchester, New Hampshire, criminal defense attorney, and a good friend of mine. And he and I are both avid uh, very amateur historians, but we both got very interested in the Lindbergh kidnapping case when I was serving then as the police chief in Goffstown, New Hampshire, which is a suburban community to our state's largest city, Manchester, New Hampshire. And Greg and I first met in the courtroom because I was prosecuting for several years for the department in the district court before I became the police chief. And so he sent me an article about the Lindbergh case, which piqued both of our interests, and it led to us doing a lot of research about the Lindbergh kidnapping case, which had been called, rightfully so, I think, the crime of the century, because it involved, in 1932, probably the most famous man in the world, and that was Charles Lindbergh, who, as you know, flew across the Atlantic Ocean in the first solo flight in the Spirit of St. Louis. So we looked at the kidnapping case, and we both ended up with a lot of questions about how it was that Bruno Richard Hauptmann, 2.5 years later, was arrested and prosecuted and then eventually executed for the kidnapping of the firstborn 20-month-old child of Charles and Ann Lindbergh. And there were so many discrepancies in the case, it just didn't make sense to either one of us as to the theory of the prosecution, and that is that um, somehow Bruno Richard Hauptmann was able to know that the Lindberghs would be at their home in Hopewell, New Jersey, which was still under construction at the time, at a time and place when they weren't ordinarily there because most of the week they spent living with Anne's parents in a different location. And so how did he know that? And how would he manage to put a ladder up against the window of the second story nursery, the only window in the whole house whose shutters didn't latch? How did he know that was the baby's room? How did he do that at some time between 8:30 and 10 p.m. while people, adults, were up and moving around in the house? And how did he get there? And how did he build this ladder? And there were just so many inconsistencies, and the story didn't make sense to either one of us. So Greg spent a lot of time looking at the whole trial transcript, reading that thoroughly and reading about the trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann and the evidence that was presented to the jury at the time. And I spent a lot of time looking at the case investigation by the law enforcement agency at the time, which was the newly formed New Jersey State Police. Um, and we both ended up with the conclusion that the much more likely scenario was that this was an inside job, um, and that it was negligence which caused the death of the baby Lindbergh on that evening. And it did not make any sense that it was Bruno Richard Hauptmann who did this. Now, there are many theories about this case, many of which have come out since we first published our book, where we posited our theory, which we thought was far more probable, more plausible than Bruno Richard Hauptmann being the perpetrator. So that's why our book ended up being called Crime of the Century, the Lindbergh Kidnapping Hoax, because we didn't think it was a kidnapping in the traditional sense of the word where that you would think of today. And the other thing that in particular I said is that they never considered, which you would today in a professional police investigation, you would first look at the family members because most child abductions actually are by one or more estranged parents or people who are helping them.
Mhm.
Stranger abductions do occur, but they're very rare. Um, Law enforcement never really looked at that. Um, and while they did look at some of the household staff, because Colonel Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the first head of the New Jersey State Police, newly formed, um, he his instincts initially were pretty good. He said, "Well, it's got to be somebody on the household staff." There was a nurse in the house at the time. There was the Waitleys also there with Anne and Charles, but those were all dead ends when they did try to pursue them. And but they never looked at importantly, Charles Lindbergh. They never figured out why he called that day and told Ann to stay another night at the house. Ostensibly, the baby had a cold. He didn't want to travel back to the Morrow estate. So he told her to stay another night. He never fully explained his whereabouts. Supposedly, he arrived home about 8:30, drove up the driveway and honked the horn so people know he was home. But there's a time period there where we don't know where he was. Um, and moreover, the other thing I did is I looked at a lot of the biographies about Charles Lindbergh, and we all have this image of him, actually, of Jimmy Stewart climbing into the Spirit of St. Louis and flying across the ocean um, from the famous movie. But he was a strange guy, and he had a history of pulling very cruel and unusual.
Thanks.
Well, he called them pranks. A lot
Right.
of people that he did things to, they didn't think they were funny at all. But
No.
and in fact, about 3.5 months before this alleged kidnapping, he had hidden the baby in a closet in the large, very large
Hey.
Morrow estate, and caused everybody to panic that the baby was missing, only to pull him out and say, "See, here he is."
Mhm.
And nobody in the house, by the way, thought that was funny,
No.
including Anne. So we looked at that and we said, look, it's far more plausible that this was an inside job that caused the negligence. It was our theory, it was Charles Lindbergh himself who was trying to pull another hoax and it went terribly awry. And the baby was killed negligently, and the kidnapping was a cover-up for that. Now, that's not to say that Bruno Richard Hauptmann was not involved in trying to get ransom money, because there were several demands and lots of notes about ransom monies during this. And in fact, there were at least two instances where ransom money was paid out to people.
Right.
And one of those payments, some of that money ended up in Bruno Richard Hauptmann's house. And so certainly that's circumstantial that he had some involvement in it, but it doesn't mean that he was actually the guy on the ladder. who
right,
crawled into that window that fateful night in Hopewell, New Jersey. And that's the premise of our book.
right. Since now your book was published in 1993, and because of your book, and I have to admit, because of my website, which at the time was the only website dealing with this issue, so many people engaged in the forum. My goodness, for years and years, people were every day talking about it, reading about it. So much has been learned, but basically the same thing, the same unanswerable questions about how did the baby die? When did the baby die? Nobody knows when the child died or how he even died. But regarding your belief that the police, and I always believe this, but I don't think it's true really, that every policeman never, that none of the cops engaged in thinking privately, did the father do this? Did the mother? I think that they were terrified of Charles Lindbergh being who he was and the type of personality he was. Michael Melsky came up with some police officers, grandchildren, I don't know, people who admitted they were terrified of losing their job. It was the Depression. And
Right.
what do you think about that? That some of the cops actually understood, or the FBI agents, maybe they couldn't say it out loud. Of course, the newspapers would never publish any thought like that. So what do you think? Maybe the cops were not as your claim in your book, because I know your book very well, I love it, is that officers didn't go to sociological training in those years like they do today, right?
So,
They don't,
that's certainly part of it, dealing. It's hard to compare a law enforcement agency, especially one that's newly formed,
hmm,
right? This was the brand new New Jersey State Police. Um, it's hard to compare them to a modern law enforcement agency today, where we know so much more about crimes against children and the kinds of
right,
steps you would take ordinarily, and also the all the advances in criminology in terms of being able to test DNA and all of
right,
that didn't exist then.
right,
But you're correct. It was our reading of all the evidence that all along the way that the law enforcement people involved in this case deferred to Charles Lindbergh.
right,
In fact, he ended up being the head of what we called the four colonels, and they did basically what he told them to do.
right.
For example,
Until the
there was
child was found, I think, until the corpse was found, and then
right.
he had to
Yeah.
relinquish some of his
Yes,
authority, right?
that's
Yeah,
correct. But one thing that would have happened certainly today is there would have been a full autopsy with pathology
right.
done on the body, and he didn't allow that.
No, he
The
cremated
baby, there
him.
was never a full autopsy done on the baby.
Right.
He and Betty Gow identified the child as theirs. I mean, as the
As the
baby.
baby. Yeah.
Right, but there was never a full autopsy done, and
No,
certainly that would never be allowed today.
no.
That would have
Well,
been
wasn't
considered
it,
at that point a homicide investigation.
was it, this is an interesting point. Was it a crime at that time? Today, it would certainly be a crime to destroy the body of a crime scene, right? It wouldn't, the family wouldn't have the ability to cremate the remains of someone
No,
who was
the
murdered.
family. If in today's world, in an investigation of this sort, that would have been treated as a homicide scene, and
And the
of course
family wouldn't have the right
the
to
family
cremate.
would not have the right to say no. You're not going to do an autopsy on my child.
But was it at that time in New Jersey
It,
allowable?
Apparently, I
Well,
mean,
no, it's
that's
not.
what happened.
Yeah, but it only happened because he was the most famous man in the world. I'm just saying, if it was an ordinary resident of the neighborhood, would they have been arrested for?
I don't know what the criminal statutes in New Jersey were in 1932 with that particular question, Ronelle. But I will say this, that they did defer to them. Now,
Right.
could they have probably have gotten the county attorney gone to court and gotten an order from the court saying we need the autopsy. They probably could have,
They could
but
have.
they didn't.
They didn't.
They didn't. The statutes may not have been such that they could say no to him, even if they were inclined to do so. But there was no indication that they were inclined to do so.
You know of Schwarzkopf's statement that he made publicly because it was printed in every newspaper. There was no oath I wouldn't break to serve Charles. I'm paraphrasing it, but
Right. Yes.
there's no oath I wouldn't break to
Right.
help Charles Lindbergh, which is so inappropriate for the chief of, he was the superintendent of the state police, and he made that comment. Didn't he understand what he was saying when he said it? Well, you don't know the answer. Nobody.
So I don't know. We know what his statement to the press was, assuming it's accurate. Again, it's a deference given to people. Remember, this is pre-Watergate stuff,
Right,
where the media it gave great deference to our presidents, to
right,
people's prominence and importance. They don't do that today, of course. But this was 1932, and remember, he came home a hero. He was
right,
they brought him home and his plane on a Navy ship
right,
to thousands, tens of thousands of people greeting him in New York City Harbor because
right,
he was a hero. I mean, there
right.
was great deference given to him.
Is there anything, this is the big question. I was kidding around about your name, how to pronounce it, but the biggest question I've always wanted to ask you and Gregory, since 1993, have you ever changed your mind about anything you wrote or made new theories in your head? Anything new or anything that you've changed your mind about? I don't know what.
Well, I'm speaking only for myself, but
Right.
Greg and I talked about this too. We still think that our theory is the most plausible one about this case. Now, thanks to you and others,
Mhm.
there is a court proceeding going on in New Jersey to try and do some minimally invasive DNA testing, which is
Mhm.
quite possible now, on in particular, from my perspective the original ransom note that Charles Lindbergh claimed he found on the windowsill of
Right here, this
yeah,
window.
where the baby went out. And supposedly, and that was after people had already been in the room and nobody else saw this. So that was another tell to us.
Mhm.
And so if they can do some DNA testing on that original note,
Right.
uh, that will help answer a lot of questions about this case and some of the subsequent ransom notes that were received. It is possible to do that now, but the New Jersey State Police is resisting that and has denied access to those envelopes for that kind of testing. But it is in court now, and there is a request for that testing to be allowed. So.
Yeah.
Hopefully they'll do that. But no, to answer your question, I haven't changed my mind. I think that doesn't mean that Colonel Richard Hauptmann wasn't involved in a scheme to get some of the ransom money.
Yeah.
But we do not think he was the guy on the ladder
No.
going up to that second story window and who took the baby from the crib.
Half the time, I don't even think anybody was on the ladder. And then another half of the time, I start thinking, well, maybe something went up and down the ladder. But no, it's a plant as far as I'm concerned. But as a joke, that's what I mean. Because I asked Gregory once, did you ever consider that he did it on purpose because there might have been something wrong with the child? And Gregory seemed, if I remember correctly, he said that you did consider it, but you chose to go with the less shocking scenario because at the time you wrote the book, oh my goodness, if you had come out with Lindbergh killed or like Lisa Pearlman has a book that they vivisected the child, I don't know how to
Yeah.
deal with that
So
issue, but
yeah. And there's been lots of books. Yeah, we did run across some evidence in some when I was doing the research on his biography, and there was there were some indications that some people felt there was something wrong with the child, and so
Right.
considered that, but rejected it. That, my perspective on in terms of dealing with human behavior and what I saw as a law enforcement officer after 38 years was that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Mm,
So if you look at Charles Lindbergh's past behavior, his
true.
cruel pranks towards Anne, towards what he did in trying to hide the baby before this incident. So those were all tells to us,
Right.
as was some of the things he did that night. The
Right.
first call he made was not to the police. The first call he made was to his attorney.
Breckenridge.
So, which we also found a little bit odd. But so there were a number of indications. We don't claim to have solved the crime forever, but we say, and I still believe that our theory is the most plausible one.
Mhm.
And we hope that the court grants the permission yeah, to do some minimally invasive DNA testing of
Right.
the envelopes and the stamps, and they can do that without destroying the notes.
Yeah, well, I just found my letter last night. I sent it to Kurt Pahatch. Uh, I tried to get them to do DNA. In 2001, I received a letter from Colonel Dunbar, who was the head of the police, saying blah blah blah. It was a no, no, no. They never got. That's just been stonewalling, and it makes no sense because they could get rid of all of us. They may be making fun of people like us, but they could make us go away and never show our faces again if all they had to do, if they were so secure in the trial being a fair one and everything was just and putting a human being in an electric chair. They rushed him into the electric chair to close, obviously to close the case. Speaking of rushing somebody into the electric chair, you should tell us about the standoff that you engaged in. This is amazing because Waco is still in many people's minds, the Koresh
Yep.
event and all of that. And amazing. Go ahead, show us the book that you just wrote.
So just by way of background, I did 30 years with the Goffstown, New Hampshire Police Department. So it's a community of about 20,000 people and it has a college, St. Anselm College, within our
Mm,
borders. And it's in southern New Hampshire, about an hour north of Boston. The last 15 years, I served as a police chief there. After I retired, President George W. Bush appointed me the U.S. Marshal for the District of New Hampshire. Now, the U.S. Marshal Service is the oldest law enforcement agency in
in
federal law
country.
enforcement in the country. It was formed in 1789, and in fact, President George Washington swore in the first 13 U.S. Marshals,
Right.
including my predecessor in New Hampshire, a guy named John Parker. He was the first U.S. Marshal for the District of New Hampshire. So there are 94 districts now around the country, and the Marshal Service, their main job is to protect the federal judiciary, to serve warrants from the courts, to find fugitives, to enforce the provisions of the Adam Walsh Act, and find missing and exploited children. Those are their primary investigative missions now. I became the U.S. Marshal in New Hampshire in 2002, and I served in that position until the end of 2009. So for 7.5 years, I was a U.S. Marshal. The deputy U.S. Marshals in all of the districts, they are civil servants like FBI agents and DEA
The
agents.
deputy say that.
The deputy U.S. Marshals in every district. And in New Hampshire, when I walked into the office as the head of that office,
Oh, I
as
see.
the U.S. Marshal, I had eight, could have, no, I could have, it was 11.
Deputies.
I had 11 deputy U.S. Marshals all
Oh,
in that office because they are civil servants. They
right. So they're the
test.
ones who evict people from their homes during the crisis, the 2008 mortgage crisis. They were going around. I just watched Capitalism, a Love Story by Michael Moore the other day. It's a great documentary and it deals with the failure of the banks, 2008 failure. And it deals with all these people around the country who were being put out of their homes by U.S. Marshals. and the marshal would come and break down the door. The people would not. I don't want to distract from what you're going to tell us
So,
about, but
so the U.S. they are charged with enforcing federal court orders.
uh-huh,
So if a federal judge issues a warrant, for example, for the arrest of someone, they
right,
give them
right,
that is the responsibility of the U.S. Marshals to serve that
right.
warrant, which is how we got involved in this case, which led to my book,
Wow,
which is called No One Has to Die.
I love the title.
And
Mm.
this is a case that our team handled while I was the U.S. Marshal in New Hampshire. And this involved a standoff which lasted 266 days, almost 9 months,
Incredible.
in, in Plainfield, New Hampshire, which is a beautiful little community up in the middle of New Hampshire, right along the Connecticut River. Across the river is the state of Vermont. And this is a wonderful artist and farming community of about 2,600 people. But living there at the time were Ed and Elaine Brown. Now, Ed and Elaine Brown were indicted by a grand jury in 2006 for failure to pay income tax for a period of 10 years.
Oh,
And despite the IRS trying to get them to come in and work out a settlement, they usually try and do it civilly first. They refused. Ed Brown was also the head of the U.S. Constitution Rangers, a militia group which started in the wake of the Waco tragedy, where
yeah,
so many people died, and also Ruby Ridge, where a deputy U.S. Marshal, a decorated deputy
died.
marshal, was killed.
No,
And the FBI ended up shooting Randy Weaver's wife
I,
in the head, and she died, as well as one of their sons. So when this started, the IRS criminal division came to us and said, "Listen, we're going to get in and we're going to indict these folks. He's a militia guy. They live in a well-fortified home on which is a picture of which is on the front of
wow.
cover of the book on 110 acres in a remote section of Plainfield, New Hampshire, and he has a lot of guns, and they both carry guns, he and his wife. And his wife was a very prominent dentist who had a great practice in the neighboring community of Lebanon, New Hampshire. But she bought into this nonsense, like many tax deniers that actually believe you don't have to pay an income tax on your personal income, which is, of course, nonsense, which
Right.
is why they were indicted. And they ended up owing the federal government about $650,000 plus penalties and interest. It was over $1 million that they owed the federal government because they refused to pay their income taxes on income, which was mostly Dr. Brown's income. That led to a trial that started in January of 2007, where the Browns showed up for the first 4 days of the trial, but they refused to show up for the fifth day. And that started a 9 month armed standoff with militia guys in the hills of the beautiful live free or die state of New Hampshire. So this is what the book is about. We were determined when this started that there was not going to be another Waco or Ruby Ridge in the hills of New Hampshire. We did not want Plainfield, New Hampshire to join the lexicon of Waco and Ruby Ridge. So we determined, we being the team that I worked with my great deputy U.S. Chief Deputy U.S. Marshal Gary D. Martino, and another guy, David Dimmitt, who was a chief inspector in our region, who ended up living with us for most of this standoff, helping out with this. We had a plan of how we wanted to do this, but it took a long time to get there. And eventually, how we did it was the oldest trick in the book, Trojan horse.
What?
Um,
What
we
the old?
got the Trojan horse trick.
Oh, I thought you were gonna. We don't. We're running out of time. We're gonna have to do a part two in a little while. But
Yep.
there's another trick they use where they send free tickets to a football game.
Yes. Well,
Have you ever used that
we
one?
talk about that in the book. The Marshal Service is one thing we try and do is when we go out and serve warrants, particularly for dangerous wanted felons, oftentimes armed, frequently trying their best to avoid arrest at all costs. We want to arrest them in as safe a place as
Right.
possible. If we know in this case, for example, that they're holed up in this house and they have a three-story turret at the top, and he has long guns, and he can see the approach to the area around the house, and he could shoot at people. And if they start shooting at law enforcement, well, guess what's going to happen? Law enforcement's going to shoot back.
Feedback. Yeah.
So, to defend themselves. So, we wanted to avoid that. So, we ended up, the way we resolved this in the end, is uh, a, some very brave undercover deputy U.S. Marshals convinced the Browns that they were coming there to support them. They were like-minded supporters who
Right.
believed in their cause,
Right.
and
Hmm.
we arrested them in the evening on the front porch while they were drinking
Eating
beer and eating pizza. So nobody died.
6 months of this. It's amazing. Can we do a second part because they're gonna
Sure.
Zoom is just out to get us. I'm
Okay.
paranoid already about Zoom. I'm kidding. Oh, I love talking to you, and I have so many more questions about the Lindbergh case and your attitude about the the investigation and all that. So can we meet again in a little while and do part two? You don't have to
Sure. We
go
could,
anywhere, right?
we could do a part two, and I'd love to tell you a little bit more about my latest
Yes, yes. I can't wait to read
which
it.
which just came out in October of last year. So
Oh, it's a year old. I just bought it
no,
last.
just a few months old. It was October. It was released on October 4th. So it's
Oh,
six months old now.
yeah. And have you ever told your another question I'd like to hear your answer to when you're a U.S. Marshal and you hang around other U.S. Marshals, do they, because of your book about Lindbergh, have you had any blowback or feedback or
No,
do
not really.
people,
I mean,
no,
not really.
nobody
When
had,
it first came out, there was a lot of attention paid to our book, and we did get some blowback from some people saying, "Well, you don't really have the evidence," and we say, "Well, we're
oh,
not purporting to have finally solved the crime. We're saying this scenario, based on circumstantial evidence, the same kind of evidence that sent Bruno Richard Hauptmann to the electric chair." The
right.
circumstantial evidence tells us, based on our analysis, our theory is more plausible.
It is.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
that's so. But yeah, initially we got some blowback. But when I didn't become marshal till 2002, so that was some time after our first book, the book about the Lindbergh case came out. So
Oh, so that your fellow,
very few people even knew I had written a book
oh, oh, I see. And I
or
was surprised
co-authored a book.
because Lindbergh is considered such a patriotic name and personality. When I opened up the web, when I began the website, I started getting nasty emails from neo-Nazis. You never got that?
Um,
People like the ones you were
so
trying to lock up because they're part of the same white supremacist Christian identity,
yes, the Christian
sovereign, what do
identity,
they call themselves?
sovereign citizens.
Sovereign citizens that,
They don't believe in the federal government.
right, they don't, right.
They don't believe in government at all, essentially. They're
Yeah,
sovereign.
but there are people who are, not, what are they called? Forgot the word. But people who, whatever.
They're extremists. They're
Yeah,
extreme, yes, and in their
right.
belief systems. And oftentimes they also buy into this, tax denier movement.
Yeah, I don't know
Some
where that,
tax deniers are people who just believe they don't have to pay federal, but they're not necessarily militia or
right,
sovereign citizen members, but
right.
oftentimes, more often than not, sovereign citizens do believe they don't have to pay federal income taxes. So
And they make up their own laws. Like, I don't know why
some
Zoom
of
has
them,
not
yes.
shut me down yet, but we're still talking. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
But Because the foundation of America is no taxation without representation, so
Right.
they expropriate that powerful meaning that started our country
Right.
on the road, and they take that idea and make their own rules about it, their own history, but um,
Their own extremist beliefs
their
about.
own right. But I know about Christian identity because the basis of that was something called British Israelism that was associated with Henry Ford, who was Lindbergh's friend. So I
Right.
read a lot about Henry Ford and his secretary, William Cameron,